Look at her, right there, in the center of the frame. She is 23 years old. Her hair is set perfectly. Her dress is immaculate. She is standing beside a man who will one day become one of the most powerful senators in American history. And she is smiling. It is a beautiful smile, but watch it carefully. Watch the way it sits on her face, composed, practiced, radiant from a distance, and then notice what it doesn't do. It doesn't reach her eyes. The eyes are somewhere else entirely, calm in the way that still water is calm, not because nothing is moving, but because everything is happening underneath. That photograph is not a record of happiness. It is a record of performance. And here is what that performance would eventually require of her. She would stand silently beside a husband who was publicly, repeatedly unfaithful, and say nothing. She would lose 4 pregnancies, absorb 3 political assassinations within her own family, survive a plane crash that nearly killed her husband, and say nothing. She would one day stand at the funeral of a 28-year-old woman who died trapped in a car her husband escaped from, and say nothing. She would smile. For 30 years, she would smile. This is not a story about glamour. This is a story about what it costs to maintain the appearance of it, long after the reality has collapsed entirely. Virginia Joan Bennett was born on September 2nd, 1936, in Riverdale, New York. She grew up in a world of quiet privilege, not the dynastic wealth of the Kennedys, but the solid, a comfortable prosperity of a family that valued presentation, achievement, and order. From the outside, it was an enviable childhood, but Joan was not, at her core, a creature of surfaces. She was something more interior than that. What she loved, genuinely, deeply loved, was music. She had begun piano lessons as a small child, and what started as structured obligation became, over time, the thing she turned to when nothing else made sense. She was talented in the way that rare students are talented, not just technically proficient, but emotionally expressive. She could play a piece and make people feel something. That is a different skill than simply playing it correctly. Not everyone who studies music for years ever develops it. Joan developed it naturally. She studied at Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart in Purchase, New York. She was tall, blonde, blue-eyed, striking in the way that made people respond to her before she said a word. A fact she knew, with a mixture of pleasure and mild discomfort. She was also genuinely kind, not performatively kind, quietly, instinctively attuned to the feelings of the people around her, sensitive in the way musicians often are, attuned to register, to tone, to the things slightly beneath what is being said. That sensitivity would be her greatest gift at the piano. In the world she was about to enter, it would be treated as a liability. She was 21 years old when she met Edward Moore Kennedy. The meeting happened through Ted's sister Jean, a friend of Joan's at college. Edward Kennedy, in 1957, was 25 years old, and already carrying the full weight of what it meant to be the youngest Kennedy son. His brothers were legends in their own lifetimes. John was preparing a presidential run. Robert was sharpening himself into a weapon on the Senate Rackets Committee. And Ted, charming, warm, enormous in physical presence, was expected to carry his share of the family's extraordinary ambitions. He was also, by virtually every account, instantly compelling. Joan fell in love quickly. He was handsome and funny and attentive. He moved through the world with a confidence that must have seemed, to a young woman still finding her footing, almost intoxicating. He made her feel seen. He made her feel chosen. What she did not fully understand, what perhaps no one explained to her clearly enough, was what being chosen by a Kennedy actually meant. They were married on November 29, 1958, St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church, Bronxville, New York. The wedding was elegant, large, beautifully photographed. Joan was radiant in white. The photographs are stunning, and for a time, perhaps the happiness in those photographs was real. But she was not simply marrying a man, she was marrying a system, and the system had rules she had not yet been shown. To understand what happened to Joan Kennedy, you first have to understand the world she married into, not as mythology, not as Camelot, but as a machine. Joseph Kennedy Sr. had built it deliberately, a family organized around legacy, power, and the projection of absolute strength. Weakness was not tolerated, or failure was not displayed. Difficulty was managed internally, quietly, with the ruthless competence of people who understood that image was as important as reality. Perhaps more, in this machine, women occupied a specific and rigidly defined role. They were supportive, they were beautiful, they were publicly faithful, they raised children, managed households, appeared at the correct events in the correct clothes with the correct expressions. They did not complain. They did not draw attention to difficulty. They understood, because they were required to understand, that their husbands' ambitions took absolute precedence over their private needs. Always, without negotiation. Rose Kennedy was the template. She had spent decades in a marriage to a man who conducted highly public affairs. She had endured. She had performed. She had kept the family together through tragedy after tragedy, with a composure that the family called strength, and history has sometimes called something else. Joan was now expected to become that. A 22-year-old woman who played Chopin and felt things deeply was now expected to become Rose Kennedy. The gap between those two people was enormous, and no one in the Kennedy world seemed to notice it, or if they noticed, no one considered it a problem worth addressing. Ted Kennedy was elected to the United States Senate from Massachusetts in 1962. He was 30 years old, gifted with language, genuinely effective, possessed of a personal magnetism that filled rooms. He was also unfaithful, and had been almost from the beginning. This is not a rumour. This is not a retrospective accusation. It is documented, confirmed, in many cases openly known at the time by the people around them. Ted Kennedy's infidelities were a constant in their marriage, the kind of open secret that Washington in the 1960s specialized in keeping. Here is what that meant. Practically, for Joan. She would learn about her husband's affairs. She would be expected to say nothing publicly. She would be expected to appear at events on his arm, composed and beautiful, and give no outward indication that anything was wrong. She had no permission to be angry, no permission to grieve, no permission even to confide too openly, because anything said could eventually become something heard. She was the wife of a United States Senator at the center of the most famous political family in America, and she was completely, structurally, alone. In November of 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Joan was 27 years old. The grief was national. But for Joan, it was also personal. John was her brother-in-law, someone she knew, someone she had sat beside at family dinners and campaign events. And the family was expected to be strong. The whole world was watching, and the watching required composure. She composed herself. Less than a year later, in June of 1964, the small plane carrying Ted Kennedy crashed in an apple orchard in Southampton, Massachusetts. 2 people aboard were killed. Ted suffered a broken back, broken ribs, a punctured lung. She kept the composure, and then, on June 5, 1968, Robert Kennedy was shot and killed in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, moments after winning the California Democratic primary. Moments after it seemed the Kennedy dynasty might reclaim the White House. He was 42 years old. Joan was pregnant. 3 catastrophic losses in 5 years. An assassination, a near-fatal crash, another assassination, each one requiring public strength, each one adding to a weight that had no outlet. no ceremony, no permission to be set down. This is what trauma researchers call accumulation, the specific damage done not by a single event, but by the layering of losses that are never fully processed before the next one arrives. Each loss compresses the previous ones deeper. Each occasion for grief becomes, instead, another occasion for performance. And somewhere in these years, quietly, reasonably, almost inevitably, she began to drink. It didn't happen suddenly. It rarely does. It began as relief, a drink to quiet the anxiety before an event, a drink to soften the edge of an evening that required more than she had, a drink to create a few hours of manageable numbness in a life that had become, privately, unmanageable. It was quiet, still hidden, still the kind of thing people around her could explain away. But it was there. Joan Kennedy had 3 miscarriages. This fact appears in most accounts of her life in a single sentence, usually in a list of difficulties, sandwiched between political events. But a miscarriage is not an item in a list. It is the loss of something wanted, something hoped for, something that existed and then didn't. It is a grief with no public ritual, no ceremony, no socially sanctioned period of mourning. Joan had 3 of them. 3 of them, while simultaneously managing the public image of a marriage that was quietly disintegrating, while attending state functions, while campaigning, while being the wife that the situation required. She had 3 of them. And the Kennedy world moved on, because the Kennedy world always moved on. She had 3 children who survived. Cara in 1960, Edward Jr. in 1961, Patrick in 1967. She loved them. By every account, her love for her children was one of the realest, least complicated things in her life during these years. But the losses, all of them, layered together with no permission to be processed, were doing something to her internal architecture that no amount of public composure could prevent. The music receded. There was no room for it in the life she was living. The quiet interiority of sitting at a piano and feeling something had no place in the Kennedy world. She drank more, still manageable, still within the range of what people around her could explain away, because explaining away and ignoring was what this world did best. And then the summer of 1969 arrived. Take a breath, because this section requires care. On the night of July 18th, 1969, the same week Apollo 11 was landing on the moon. Senator Edward Kennedy attended a party on Chappaquiddick Island, Massachusetts. Present were Ted and several young women who had worked on Robert Kennedy's presidential campaign, and women who had given enormous amounts of themselves to a campaign that ended in an assassination. Sometime after midnight, Ted Kennedy left the party with one of those women, Mary Jo Kopechner, 28 years old, from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. He took a wrong turn. He drove off the Dyke Bridge. The car went into the dark water below. Ted Kennedy escaped from the submerged vehicle. Mary Jo Kopechner did not. She drowned. What happened next is documented fact. Ted Kennedy did not call the authorities. He did not report the accident. He left the scene, swam back to the mainland, returned to his hotel, and slept. He reported the accident the following morning, approximately 9 hours after Mary Jo Kopechner died. By then, divers had already found the car. She had already been dead for hours. The legal consequences were, by any honest measure, astonishing in their leniency. Kennedy pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of an accident. He received a 2-month suspended sentence, no jail time. The inquest findings were sealed for years, and a young woman's death became, in the public record, a career inconvenience. A 28-year-old woman drowned in a submerged car. The man driving received a suspended sentence and went on to serve in the United States Senate for another 40 years. Now consider what this moment meant for Joan Kennedy. She had not been at the party. She was home. Pregnant with what would become her fourth pregnancy. A pregnancy she would lose 2 months later in a miscarriage. She was not consulted about how the incident would be handled. She was not asked what she needed. Besides, she was expected, as she had always been expected, to appear beside her husband, to project the right combination of solemnity and support. She was expected to attend Mary Jo Kopechne's funeral. She stood at the funeral of a 28-year-old woman who had died trapped in a car her husband escaped from. She stood there wearing a neck brace. She was carrying a child she was about to lose, and she performed the role required of her. 2 months later, Ted Kennedy went on national television to address the incident. He expressed remorse. He wondered aloud whether there was some awful curse hanging over the Kennedy family. He was speaking from a carefully prepared script, crafted by advisors. Joan was not among them. She miscarried 2 months later. She never spoke publicly about what those months cost her. She was not given the space to. The story was Ted's story, his crisis, his management, his political survival. Joan was a supporting character in it, as she had always been. Chappaquiddick did not break Joan Kennedy in a single dramatic moment. It broke something much deeper than that, something structural, something that had been holding her together through all the previous years of accumulated silence. And once broken, that thing would not be rebuilt. The 1970s were a decade of slow deterioration. Her alcoholism, quiet, private, manageable in the way that alcoholism can seem manageable before it isn't, became more present, more visible. She began to miss events, to appear at events in states that people noticed, worried about. Owen mostly did not address directly, because direct address was not how the Kennedy world operated. She sought treatment, more than once. She checked into facilities. She made genuine, sustained efforts to stop drinking, and she would achieve sobriety, sometimes for significant stretches, only to relapse. Under the pressure of a new public crisis, a new expectation, a new occasion requiring her to perform a version of herself, she was finding increasingly impossible to maintain. Here is the thing about the treatment Joan received in these early years. It treated the drinking. It addressed the symptom. It could not address the marriage she returned to after treatment, the ongoing infidelities, the isolation, the structural requirement of her life, and that she suppress everything real about herself in service of an image. She would get sober. She would return to the same conditions that made drinking feel necessary. She would relapse. This is not weakness. This is predictable. This is what happens when you treat the response without treating the cause. She was in her 30s. She had 3 children she loved. She was the wife of a senator considered a strong presidential candidate. She had been on the covers of magazines, and she was, in the most fundamental sense, disappearing. In November of 1979, Edward Kennedy announced he would challenge incumbent President Jimmy Carter for the Democratic presidential nomination. For Joan, the campaign was a negotiation. She agreed to participate. She agreed to appear, to campaign, and to speak publicly on his behalf. Consider the weight of that agreement for a moment. Joan Kennedy, a woman in active struggle with alcoholism, in a marriage that existed almost entirely as public performance, who had spent 20 years being systematically excluded from decisions that directly affected her life, agreed to campaign for her husband's presidency. She did it, at least in part, because campaigning gave her something she had almost never had inside the Kennedy system: a voice of her own. She gave interviews. She spoke with a candor unusual for a political wife of the era, acknowledging her alcoholism publicly, describing her struggles with a directness that required real courage. At the 1980 Democratic National Convention, She delivered a speech that was widely praised. But the campaign also exposed her in ways that were not always kind. There were public moments of visible fragility. The tabloid press moved in. She was photographed at her most vulnerable, written about, assessed, pitied, criticised, treated simultaneously with sympathy and contempt. In the specific way American media has always handled women, who appear to be struggling publicly. Ted Kennedy lost the primary to Carter. Carter lost the general to Reagan. The campaign ended. Joan had given significant personal cost to support it. She received nothing in return. Joan and Ted Kennedy separated in 1981. The divorce was finalized in 1982. 24 years of marriage, 3 children, 4 pregnancies lost, 1 career built entirely around his ambitions, 1 identity organized entirely around his name. She was 45 years old. She had never, as an adult woman, built a life of her own. She had moved directly from her parents' house to the Kennedy marriage, from her own identity to the role of senator's wife, without the intermediate period in which most people quietly figure out who they actually are. Now, for the first time, that question was entirely and unavoidably hers to answer. Who was she? Not Ted Kennedy's wife, not the woman in the photograph, not the public figure at fundraisers and conventions. Who was Joan Bennett, the woman who had existed before the Kennedy name was attached to her, and who was now, at 45, being asked to reconstruct that person from what remained? It is, in many ways, the hardest work a human being can do. She had to do it while still struggling with addiction, while still being recognized everywhere she went as a specific kind of public failure, while still being, in the eyes of most people who looked at her, the woman who couldn't hold herself together inside the Kennedy family. Not the woman the Kennedy family couldn't hold together, the woman who couldn't hold herself together. The distinction matters enormously. She went back to school. In 1981, Joan enrolled at Lesley College in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She completed a master's degree in music education. She studied seriously. She engaged. This fact gets lost, consistently, in accounts of her life, because it doesn't fit the narrative of the woman who fell apart, a woman returning to school at 45, finishing a graduate degree, or it is demonstrating something, that the person who existed before the Kennedy machine absorbed her was still there, still curious, still capable, still in possession of an interior life that had not been entirely extinguished. She performed publicly as a pianist. She appeared with orchestras. She spoke about music education with a genuine passion. That was not the manufactured enthusiasm of a political spouse at a campaign event. It was the real thing. The voice of someone who has loved something their entire life and is finally being allowed to say so. In these moments, at a piano, absorbed in something authentically hers, there was a quality in photographs of Joan Kennedy, almost entirely absent from the thousands of images taken of her during her years as a senator's wife. She looked like herself. But recovery is not linear. The drinking continued through the 1980s and into the 1990s. There were hospitalizations. There were public incidents. Newspaper stories reported with the inevitable blend of pity and prurience that reduced a complex human struggle to a celebrity cautionary tale. She worked with alcoholism advocacy organizations. She spoke honestly about her own experience in ways that helped people. That advocacy was real. It mattered. But helping others and helping yourself are not the same thing. Her children grew. Cara Kennedy became a documentary filmmaker and an advocate for mental health awareness. Edward Kennedy Jr. became a lawyer and a prominent advocate for disability rights. Patrick Kennedy entered politics, was elected to Congress from Rhode Island, and eventually became one of the most important voices in America on mental health and addiction policy. Consider that last fact carefully. The son who watched his mother battle addiction for most of his childhood became one of Congress's leading advocates for treating addiction as a public health issue rather than a moral failure. Joan's suffering produced, in at least one of her children, a life's work. That is not a comfortable thing to say. It is also true. There were public incidents in the years that followed, moments when Joan was found disoriented, when she needed medical attention, when the ongoing reality of her alcoholism became briefly visible in the public record again. Each time, the coverage followed the same template: the former Kennedy wife, still struggling. A sad reminder. A cautionary tale. What the coverage never addressed, because it rarely does, is that she was in her 70s. She had survived what she had survived. She had raised 3 children, earned a graduate degree, built a relationship with music that had outlasted everything the Kennedy world had done to her. And she was, despite everything, still here. The woman they were writing about as a cautionary tale was also an extraordinarily durable human being. Both things were true. On September 16, 2011, Cara Kennedy died of a heart attack at a gym in Washington, D.C. She was 51 years old. She had survived lung cancer years before. Her death was sudden, unexpected, the kind of loss that arrives without preparation and reorganizes everything. Joan Kennedy outlived her daughter, and Ted Kennedy had died 2 years earlier, on August 25, 2009, from a brain tumor. He was 77 years old. He had served in the United States Senate for 46 years. His death was mourned enormously. The Lion of the Senate, the last Kennedy brother, a figure of historical consequence, whatever else he was. Joan attended his funeral. Whatever their marriage had been, whatever the 24 years of infidelity and isolation and silence had actually cost both of them, he had been the organizing structure of her adult life, the name she carried, the world she inhabited, the source of both her public identity and her private destruction. She sat at his funeral among the family, among the history, among the cameras. She was composed. She had been composing herself in front of cameras for more than 50 years. The woman sitting in that church had been a 21-year-old girl who played piano when Ted Kennedy met her. She had lost 4 pregnancies. She had stood at a young woman's funeral under circumstances that no amount of composed expression could make acceptable. She had campaigned for a man who was unfaithful to her throughout their entire marriage. She had been divorced, written about, pitied, reduced. She had lost a daughter. She had watched the man who shaped and damaged her life more than anyone else be buried with full national honours. And she sat there, still, composed. Go back to the beginning. That photograph, the young woman standing beside the man who will become a senator, the perfect dress, the smile that doesn't reach her eyes. She is 23 years old. She does not yet know about Chappaquiddick. She does not yet know about the 4 pregnancies she will lose, or the daughter she will outlive, or the moment she will stand at a 28-year-old woman's graveside in a cervical collar while carrying a child she is about to lose. She doesn't know any of that yet. And still, look at her eyes. The distance is already there, which means the cost began even earlier than the catastrophes. It began with the daily requirement, quiet, relentless, elegantly enforced, to be something other than what she was, to perform an image, to suppress what she felt, to inhabit a role that fits someone else's needs, and call it her own life. We tell Joan Kennedy's story as a story about weakness, about the woman who fell apart while the Kennedys endured. But that version of the story requires you not to ask the obvious question: what exactly was she supposed to endure? She was supposed to endure a husband's serial infidelity in silence. She was supposed to survive 3 political assassinations within her family in composure. She was supposed to stand at a dead woman's funeral, 7 months pregnant, in a neck brace, because the image required it, in grace. She was supposed to recover from alcoholism while returning repeatedly to the conditions that made drinking feel necessary, with strength. She was supposed to do all of that without acknowledgement, without support, and without ever once allowing the public to see that it was costing her anything. On the question is not why she struggled to hold herself together. The question is what kind of system requires a human being to hold herself together under those conditions, and then describes her as weak when she can't. Joan Bennett Kennedy played the piano. Before the name, before the image, before the expectation and the silence and the long, quiet cost of both. She sat down at an instrument. She felt something. She let it move through her hands. For a little while, in those moments, she was exactly who she was. Not the woman who fell apart, not the woman behind the senator, not the cautionary tale, just a woman who felt things deeply, who had the gift of translating feeling into sound, and who deserved, as every human being deserves, a life with enough room in it to be exactly that. She was not given that life. She built what she could from what was left.